Hi, everyone. Welcome to our module on anarchism. Um, Last module, we've been talking about global warming as an environmental crisis and how Al Gore's movie Inconvenient Truth was perhaps, at the end of the day, not all that inconvenient at all, reducing politics to kind of a consumerism. And we learned also how cartoons, innocent cartoons intended for children, can sometimes say things that actually are much more inconvenient for us if we want to take on, if we want to confront uh, the problems of the world. What the movie Wall-E argued at the end of the day was, I suppose, that we had to take care, we had to consider that we have a debt to future generations, even if those generations are far, far away in a spaceship, leaving a destroyed Earth behind them. But, we have to consider their humanity too. We have to consider their ownership, their property relation, if you will, to our planet. It's not just ours. Our ancestors passed on this planet to us, and we have the obligation to pass it forward as well. So, in that sense, Wally talks to us about the debt that we have, the obligation that we have to take care of the earth for future generations. Well, speaking about debts, in 2008, as you know, I'm sure, the whole world, but centered in the United States, entered into a period of major financial crisis. And it led to massive repercussions around the world, but certainly here in the United States. And in earlier modules, we've talked a little bit about people like Francis Fukuyama and globalization. And we mentioned then how Fukuyama was an advocate for an ideology, an economic ideology called neoliberalism. And we discussed a little bit then about the impact of this ideology, which says ultimately that the things human life should be organized around are principally the laws, so to speak, of the free market. That human life should be organized around the principles of the free market as much as possible, because the free market can both give us freedom and also solve our dilemma, which is where we allocate our goods and services. Neoliberalism is based on a pricing mechanism grounded in the market, and says that the optimal way to organize the allocation of goods and services comes from within that. Well, in many ways, I think the 2008 crisis was, and it's plain to see now, I think, the 2008 crisis was the result of taking that logic of the free market, that ideology of the free market, to its full extent. Now, that's not to say that financial crises have only ever happened under neoliberalism, and certainly protests of or surrounding or about financial crises have been common enough throughout human history. But as our author Cynthia Weber notes, there are two things about what happened in 2011 that are worth noting, that maybe are different to previous financial crises. First is that street level protest and organizing changed from being something that was just engaged in by only hardcore activists. The famous Battle of Seattle in 1999 comes to mind. Those were anti-globalization protests against the meeting of the World Trade Organization there. We saw a transformation from that kind of version of protesting, which was almost like to do with professional protesters, or people whose kind of identity was as a protester, to something much more to do with ordinary citizens. Because in 2011, when Occupy Wall Street broke out, it was very much ordinary citizens, I think, doing the protesting. It was not, certainly the professional protesters or whatever, the hobbyist protesters were there. But there's not enough of them to make up all the numbers that were engaged in Occupy Wall Street. And, that tradition, actually, I think that 2011 transformation has continued on, even just as I'm recording this lecture in the spring of 2019. We've seen a number of protests break out, to do with global warming. Specifically, one has been championed by a young lady, 16-year-old girl with Asperger's syndrome from Sweden, named Greta Thunberg. And she has certainly been instrumental in organizing and inspiring thousands, hundreds of thousands of high school students to go out on strike, as they did in March of 2019, to draw attention to raise their voices and hopefully be heard by politicians. That enough is enough. That it's time to do something about global warming. And then, of course, this year we've also seen in France the so-called Gilets jaunes protests against the neoliberal reforms of President Macron in France. Those neoliberal reforms were very much targeted towards increasing the price of diesel oil, which French citizens are very reliant upon, in contrast with the United States, where we drive mostly vehicles with petrol or gasoline. The French use diesel. So these tax increases were advertised by Macron's administration as being to do with the need to reduce our price in emissions. The idea of putting a price on our emissions is central to a market-based approach to dealing with global warming, very much along the lines of Al Gore last week. But of course, the irony was, at the same time Macron had done that, he had reduced the tax on the wealthy, specifically the inheritance tax that French people have to pay if they're millionaires. And ordinary French people really felt like, well, wait a minute, you're putting the squeeze on us for our consumption of diesel. We're the ones who actually use the diesel in order to save global warming. And yet you're reducing taxes on the billionaires. And for what, right? I mean, this is a context, a moment. If we take global warming seriously, as Greta Thunberg would have us do, and it'll require major investment on the part of government, in changing the way our economy is organized, and you're squandering the opportunity to use the taxes of the very, very wealthy. I mean, if you take a billionaire and you tax them half their money, say, not that would ever happen, but like say you did. I mean, usually we tax income and we tax it progressively. So it's like the more you earn, the more you get taxed, but not on the original amount, so say up to $100,000 taxes are 15-20% or something of income on an annual basis. Well, a progressive tax doesn't hit you for that first 100K, only just for that 20%, right? And it's beyond that, on what you're earning on an annual basis, that we're kind of hitting harder and then harder again. So you're still doing very well. You're still quite wealthy, even if taxes go up to like where they were after World War II on billionaires. They used to be in the United States much, much, much higher than they are now. Our millionaires don't pay very much in taxes at all lately. That money could be useful, right? And not necessarily punitive to the rich. They have 5 yachts, 10 mansions. What difference does it make if they only have 2 yachts and 5 mansions? It's kind of hard to get your head around that. Like, their lives aren't materially changed, transformed much by hitting them hard on some of their income. Yet this is what Macron was doing, which suggested that, in fact, he was being kind of two-faced about his approach to global warming. But I mention all of this because it's sort of inspirational in thinking about whether it's Greta Thunberg and the high school students going out to protest, or the Gilets jaunes in France. These are not people who are protesters. They're ordinary citizens who are just upset, to use a polite term, with the way politicians are very obviously introducing policy that helps the rich. And we'll want to say more about why capitalism today feels the need to do that, because, of course, capitalism today is not doing that well. Even here in the United States, jobs are coming back during the Trump administration. Lately in the Obama administration, it already started, but jobs are doing well in the United States today, but salaries are not. And people are finding that they have to work 2, maybe 3 jobs just to put bread on the table. And that's not really the deal, right? Capitalism if, is based on a contract, right? That you work 40 hours a week and you should be able to at least put bread on the table with that. You can work harder, work longer, work more, work another job, by the way, if you want. No one's stopping you, but the deal is sort of like that, at least at a minimum. If you do your 40 hours a week, that's kind of the cutoff point, right? You should at least be able to have a comfortable lifestyle on that. And when that's not working, capitalism is having a problem fulfilling its end of the bargain. And I mentioned that because, of course, it's the central axiom of Occupy Wall Street, right? That the system wasn't really providing the opportunities it should, or the life that it should for people. And in despair, in the wake of a major financial crisis, people were intent on showing to government, but also much more importantly, showing to their fellow citizens that, this is enough now, right? We have to stop this. And of course, there's even another case of a protest recently, the climate extinction movement, which is sweeping the United Kingdom right now. We have a mixture of professional protesters and ordinary civilians taking to the streets, very much inspired by people like Greta Thunberg, to draw attention to the fact that capitalism is not doing our ecology any favors either. But the Occupy moment, swept the world in 2011. And it seems that we're still living in this kind of Occupy moment. And the reason I say that is because we've seen repeated instances of these kinds of new style protests sweeping the world. Again, where we've seen large numbers of people taking to the streets, from Egypt to Tunisia to Greece, Spain, Portugal, a little bit in Ireland, certainly in Britain, and definitely in the United States. Now, one of the questions that Cynthia Weber wants to ask us is pertaining to this slogan that was used by the Occupy movement, and it's this idea that, okay, so you've got ordinary people out on the streets, great. And you're claiming that this is the sort of hashtag 99%, right? That it's the 99% versus the 1%. And the 1%, of course, are the wealthy elites, and the 99% are like pretty much everyone else. Like if you look at the income figures for the United States, it's something like average income is $100,000. But if you take away the top 10%, average income goes down to like $28,000 a year. It's quite striking. So 90% of Americans are living on an average of $28,000 a year, which is, pretty shit. And it's not great for a life. It's not great for a life minimally just to get by on. But then you sort of start to add in medical debt, school debt, mortgages, having a kid, all of these things, and suddenly things start to get very, very expensive. So certainly there's a sort of material way which we can speak of the 99%. But that's not really what Cynthia Weber means. She's not really talking about a material definition of the 99%. She's talking about a identity of the 99%. Did they see themselves always being the same person, or was that even the intention? So we're kind of on the hunt for that this module. And we're going to try to track down some things. And again, as before, we may not want to agree with everything Cynthia Weber says. We're just kind of following along her ideas because that's our textbook, and she's sort of the person that's kind of giving us our introduction to these ideas. So she has her own views. She's entitled to them, and we may want to diverge with those somewhat slightly. But let's stick with her where we can and see what she has to say about this question. And this myth, it's the final myth that we're looking at this semester, and we're going to be looking at it through the film The Hunger Games. So, all right. Now, just to sort of kind of move on to some basic kind of outline here of our lecture, we obviously want to understand what Occupy Wall Street meant by the idea of a 99%. We want to take a little time. I think it's very important that we do this to flesh out Um, the way in which anarchists use the term anarchy, um, this is an interesting concept for us because we've used the term anarchy before in this class. We've used it a lot in the first half of the semester. All of the theories we looked at then were anarchy theories. Realism, certainly, liberalism, constructivism. All of these theories were really about kind of taking the problem of world order in the absence of a global sovereign seriously, taking this problem seriously. Realism manages it kind of from a cynical, maybe. I think they would even agree. Cynical point of view. I'm not criticizing them. Um, uh, that we should kind of let anarchy do its thing, and what we're really looking for is a balance of power between the various states, and we should not maybe be too optimistic about stopping the wheel of history repeating itself endlessly, but just slowing it down a little bit, trying to mitigate its worst elements through the principles of realpolitik and balance of power. Liberalism, much more hopeful, much less cynical, believes that human nature can be redeemed, believes that the global system can be domesticated. Wasn't that such a key word that we looked at that time? And so via people like Immanuel Kant and Woodrow Wilson, we discussed the idea, the hope, the dream, the vision, the promise of a world order based on democracy, and we introduced ourselves to the democratic peace thesis, which states that as democracy spreads, you end up having a sphere of the world, a group of nation states, a family of nation states that have very different relationships with each other than they do with other states in the world that are not democracies. And so over history, over time, we've seen an expansion of the number of states that are part of this family. And the hope would be that someday, somehow, you end up with a perfectly horizontal world, which doesn't have a global sovereign, admittedly, but which has figured out a way to mitigate the worst effects of what we've sometimes called the prisoner's dilemma. Okay, the prisoner's dilemma is obviously a neo-realist concept designed to get us think about the system of world order as opposed to, the human nature aspect of it. The neo-realists believe that collapse of order is always sort of inevitable, and the way we avoid it becoming a disaster for us is through embracing the prisoner's dilemma as our fate, and understanding that the best possible outcome is the fact that we're not killing each other, and we should just be happy to accept that. So how does all this tie in with anarchism? That's a mystery that we will be keen to resolve in this next hour or two. And we will want to look at the thinking of one of the leading anarchist theorists of our time. That's David Graeber, who is also one of the leading thinkers, theorists behind the Occupy movement. We'll look at his history in relationship to the Occupy movement, and then we will want to try to understand his concept of debt and why it is that debt is a sort of an axial or pivotal, if that's a better way to put it, kind of part of his argument and part of why Occupy Wall Street believed it was making a contribution to our public discourse. Then we're going to try to ask ourselves, looking at the film Hunger Games, what it really means to act on one's debt, what it really means to be part of the 99%. The Hunger Games gives us a very kind of convenient test to see what it means to act for the 99%. And Cynthia Weber's going to have some points to mention there, and we'll be keen to interrogate those. But along the way here, I'm going to be mentioning a lot of my own sort of thinking about Occupy, and I think we'll have some interesting things to say about it as we go. So let's get started. Now, we all know that in 2008 there was a terrible financial crisis, and it put government under tremendous strain at the time to hold the banking system together. We were already in debt at the time, and still are, because we'd had to fight two very expensive wars. Joseph Stiglitz, the Nobel Prize-winning economist, ran some calculations and believed that over the course of sort of 20 years after 2003, 2002, the cost of the war in Iraq, the cost of the war in Afghanistan would set us back something like $4 trillion. So we have government already under tremendous strain, and once the financial crisis happened, and the government had to bail out the banks who had ostensibly behaved quite irresponsibly by lending out too much money, and not thinking enough about whether people would continue to be able to pay off their debts. Then we see that the government having to step in basically is kind of left very, very short on cash, and starts to have to cut government services, important government services like welfare, like education, like healthcare, which ultimately then are the things that most ordinary people need from government on a day-to-day basis. And so the huge numbers of people who are left kicked out of their homes by being foreclosed on, or left unemployed because their employer couldn't get access to future loans from the cash-struck banks, basically found themselves at the time they actually needed government help the most, that the government was really unable to provide for them. So this introduces us to an important term here, austerity, right? That actually in a financial crisis, that's really the time we want to see government stepping forward and entering into the economy, spending money to restore confidence and get the free market kind of back up and running again. It's an old argument that comes to us from the time of Keynes. We've talked a little bit about it before. You know that Keynes was an economist writing during the Second World War and cooperating with the British and the American governments about the design of the global post-war economy. And the success of his ideas led to a tremendously sort of stable global economy after World War II for about 30, 40 years. And America did very well during that time. The gap between the rich and the poor diminished dramatically, and education rates skyrocketed. Crime rates were good, and generally, I think societal contentment was relatively high. But of course, all that starts to go wrong in the late 60s, and there's reasons we can discuss about that another time. But the current financial crisis, by sort of turning its back on the lessons of World War II, if I can put it that way, and the Keynesian economics of World War II, revealed how fragile our current financial system is, especially when things start to go wrong. And above all, how the financialization of our economy, which has been going on since the 1970s, really affects ordinary people's lives. So just quickly, what do I mean by financialization? I mean, I think what financialization ultimately is for us is a shift away from making one's profits via the production of things to a system where you're not doing anything else other than sort of betting your money on things on the stock market. And so you're making money from types of activities that do not involve employing anyone. Typically in the past, we have had to employ people to make things for us, to sell those things, and make our profits from the making and the selling of things. But, we can bet on the stock market and not have to employ anyone at all. So as more and more of our profits come from Wall Street, especially the profits of our millionaires and billionaire class, then, you can see that has changed the economy, it's changed the stakes of the economy, and it reveals a shift in the mode of capitalism. And our question really initially for this lecture is, how has that shift towards financialization really made everyday life, has changed everyday life for people. So just to sort of comment on that, excuse me. we tend not to see the everyday aspect of financial life and the financial crisis. We think that it was a crisis that took place on Wall Street. We think it was a crisis caused by bankers working in banks like Goldman Sachs. If you watch the movie The Big Short, it's a great film. You should watch it. And it explains that there's a certain truth to this, that Goldman Sachs and others did. Bear Stearns is another one. Lehman Brothers, they did miscalculate quite badly. And in this sense, then we're not entirely wrong to say that the crisis was a crisis that took place on Wall Street, and that is fine. But it's also the case, excuse me, that the crisis also had what we would call a political excess, right? As the scholar Matt Davies puts it, this means that there's a political aspect, excuse me, there's a political aspect to the crisis that cannot be fully described if we consider it only a technical crisis or a crisis taking place on Wall Street. Excuse me, a little bit of allergies going on today. Because the crisis has been provoked by a number of protests from people who feel that their everyday lives have been hit by it, the political excess point is so important, really, because when people feel that their ordinary lives are undermined by their financial or economic situation, it really does change the way they relate to politics. So, you vote differently. The classes you choose to study, you choose differently. You choose the classes that are more likely to get you a job. You don't choose the fun, speculative, interesting stuff that's going to broaden your mind or maybe make you a better citizen. Philosophy, anthropology, you're going to care less about those things because they're not really going to add to your bottom line. And why go to school and take out all this college debt if, you're just going to study something abstract like philosophy and it's not going to help you pay back your loan. So, we tend to take these decisions quite seriously then. So that's what we mean by a political excess. It means like a political impact or a political side effect of what otherwise appears to be, again, a bunch of technical mistakes made by guys on Wall Street. And the 2011 Occupy Wall Street movement was an effort to demonstrate precisely this side effect, this political side effect, to draw attention to the fact that we can't really be citizens in a full sense. We can't make ourselves citizens. We can't enhance ourselves and grow as citizens, as political participants, if our everyday lives aren't working. Like if we're, it's kind of this, like you've probably seen this in other classes, like there's a thing called the Maslow's hierarchy of wants. It's not relevant really, but it just basically means like, food, water, shelter, right? Like if those things aren't in place, don't talk to me about politics, right? So politics is something that takes place once your basic animal needs are addressed, and that's fair, right? So critically, some people did complain about Occupy, but largely they were well received, I think, in the sense that they were just simply trying to draw attention to this nature, this significance, this importance of everyday life, which, neoliberal economics doesn't really think about, because neoliberalism only thinks about the supply and demand equation and how the market is going to fix everything, right? But actually, in a crisis, market behavior doesn't take us in a very healthy direction politically, right? It means we become narrow-minded as citizens and hunker down. That's a great word for it. We don't take as many risks with our education and with our financial lives. And it was very interesting to see the popularity of Occupy Wall Street is another point we should make, because of course, many people say millennials, young people today, are kind of politically brain dead, right? They're couch potatoes. They don't vote. They play Xbox too long. They have otherwise, sold out of politics. And I always find that a kind of a cynical view myself, because, in fact, when you look at their economic circumstances, it's actually nothing more than a great compliment to them that despite the economic hardship they were encountering, that they did kind of come out and participate in Occupy movement and all the subsequent protests that have been happening since, whether it's Black Lives Matter or what have you. Like it costs time and money to protest, and if you're up against it with your education, the cost of your education, your debt, maybe getting married, having a child, buying a house, all that debt today, because wages are so low, not just because of Trump, but because of factors going out back even previous to the 2008 crisis. Wages have been low since the 1970s, really. It's a great testament, I think, to young people that despite this kind of like constant criticism that millennials are kind of like the me generation, actually, they're the few people, they're the category of people that really were kind of desperately trying to waken us up to say, look, politics matters, and government, you need to be addressing this, right? So this is especially interesting when you think about how older generations lived in a very different world. Their world was we talk about the greatest generation and the baby boomers and how they were kind of responsible citizens, whatever, but they were the ones that benefited hugely from the fiscal largesse of government. And so when we hear people who are in their 60s or 70s saying, well, look, I'm a self-made man, everything I did it on my own, I worked hard. You're like, yeah, but the things you were manufacturing, the things you were buying and selling, the demand for that all came from Keynesian economics. So let's not get too carried away with our own sort of glory here. Young people today don't have Keynesian economics backing them up. They don't have that kind of boost on the ladder of their career that the baby boomers had. And besides that, their entire lives are surrounded by advertising as well, right? So one of the things that we have to say to people who criticize millennials is like, well, you may complain that they want all these things, but you're the ones advertising these lifestyles to them. They watch Friends, they watch other sitcoms, they watch dramas on television, and they watch adverts on television, and all they're seeing are these comfortable lives of comfortable people who are happy and blah blah blah. So is it fair really to sort of accuse them of having desires for a certain kind of lifestyle if all they're surrounded by is the impact of financialization? There's a number of factors then to consider. The debts of living today, the debts of getting a college education to get that middle class job, the surroundedness of our lives by advertising. You combine it with a poor economy, maybe jobs are increasing but wages are flat. And the point is really that young people are kind of doubly or triply encouraged to apply a very rigorous cost-benefit analysis to their decisions in the education market, and they're really not likely to want to become a philosopher or a journalist or some other career of their dreams if they have that much debt. So to be concrete then, to go back to that idea of hunkering down, all we're really saying is that young people today are, of course, risk adverse, and there's not a lot of space in our lives for art, for the spontaneous, for the humorous, for the poetic. Everything has been kind of subsumed into the logic of economic decision making. And so enter into this bizarre kind of spontaneous expression of all of those things we didn't expect millennials to be doing. And it's a great testament to them then that, of course, they take to Wall Street, they take to Zuccotti Park and engage in this very original type of protesting, which was unprecedented. This use of this kind of sort of branding that we're not just here for us, we're here for everyone because we are the 99%. And those are substantive differences with previous protests, and surprising ones at that. I think that's really my point here. Now, moving along, we know that the connection between the 99% and everyday life is a political one, and to do with this political side effect or this political excess. What about the question? What about looking at the question from the perspective of the 1%? And so here, if we want to, we can turn to the character Gordon Gekko, played by Michael Douglas in the 1986 blockbuster film Wall Street. And there's a scene which we can watch in class, or you can Google YouTube search, where Gordon Gekko is teaching his protege Bud Fox, played by Charlie Sheen, that greed is good. It's a famous quote. You can just pop it right into Google. Gordon Gekko, greed is good. Just search for that, and you'll get a film clip where Gordon Gekko is talking to an audience, about the idea that we need the 1%. That recently, by the way, as a footnote, I would add we had Jordan Peterson debating Slavoj Žižek, the Slovenian philosopher, and interestingly, Jordan Peterson made more or less the same argument that Gordon Gekko is making here. Yeah, capitalism has horrible people in charge of almost everything, and the point is, yes, they're horrible and they do horrible things, but we need them, right? They are the leaders. They are the ones that make the tough decisions, and they're the ones that push the game on. And every other system that's been tried has failed. So capitalism might suck, but it's the system that seems to be growing the economy. And so even if you don't do well in capitalism, you're at least doing a little bit better than the previous generation, right? So the famous quote then from Gordon Gekko that kind of captures this is as follows, and this is where they get the notion of the 1%, of course. The richest 1% of this country owns half of our country's wealth, $5 trillion. 1/3 of that comes from hard work. 2/3 of that comes from inheritance. Interest on interest accumulating to widows and idiot sons, and what I do, stock and real estate speculation. It's bullshit. You got 90% of the American public out there with little or no net worth, right? I create nothing, I just own, right? But I'm in this position of power. We're the ones that make the rules, pal. The news, war, peace, famine, upheaval, the price per paperclip. We pick that rabbit out of the hat while everyone sits out there wondering how the hell we did it. Now, you're not naive enough to think we're living in a democracy, are you, buddy? It's not that. It's the free market, and you're part of it, and you've got that killer instinct, so stick around, pal. I've got a lot to teach you. That's another one of the sort of best sort of quotes from that film. And it sets the tenor for Occupy Wall Street, because it's sort of interpreted by Occupy Wall Street as sort of the core cynical philosophy of free market neoliberalism. And, maybe in the 80s when this movie was made and the stock market was good and everyone had sort of pension funds invest in the stock market, it all seemed like a really great idea. But what the 2008 financial crisis taught us, I think, taught us ordinary Americans, is that greed is in fact not good. It's not good for everyone. When the crisis happens, ordinary people are asked to carry the can, and the rich get bailed out by government. There's a wonderful sort of phrase about being too big to fail. That's our banks were too big to fail, right? So we had to bail them out. And in this sense, then, the myth of the so-called trickle-down economics, right, which is that what Jordan Peterson was saying, what Ronald Reagan once said, and what Gordon Gekko was advocating as well, which is that, look, so long as you just take care of the rich people, the wealth will trickle down. It might not trickle down in the same degree as it does to the rich, but it will trickle down somewhat here. So this causes people to really sort of stop and look at these people, these Gordon Gekko type figures, and say, well, wait a minute, right? There was a promise here. There was a contract here. There was a deal here. We were going to let you guys get filthy, stinking rich, and then we were going to put our pensions in the stock market and take out mortgages and buy our homes and live the American dream, right? We were going to have a job, work 40 hours a week, and it was going to be great. And of course, what we realize is that nothing like that at all happened. Instead, the rich got bailed out and the poor had to carry the can, because the rug got pulled out from under them. The job, the wages, the conditions of possibility that made it possible to get the mortgage, to get the school education, to get the house, all the rest, to get married, to have the babies. So the deal was sort of exposed, right? It was exposed as a fraud. And it wasn't anyone's fault, only the silly, stinking rich people placing bets on bets on bets in this kind of weird voodoo economics. And ultimately, you know, gambling not just their own wealth, but the wealth of the nation on these schemes. And it hasn't worked. It didn't work. And we're still living in the shadow of it today. So this is, I suppose, where the idea of the 90%, or as Occupy Wall Street calls it, the 99%, then comes from. This is everybody else who got dicked over, right? The richest 1% of the country owns half of everything. 99% owns half of everything else, and basically got dicked over by the mistakes of the 1%. So Occupy Wall Street, in this sense, acquires this mantra of the 99%. And it gives it a language through which it can express the grievances of ordinary, everyday Americans who have their citizenship cut off from them, have their futures cut off from them, have their potential well-being, future happiness cut off from them, and want to express their dissatisfaction, right? And find themselves suddenly living in this thing we can call the rent economy, where now, because wages are so low, even if you work all the hours that God gives you, you're still kind of stuck in a situation where you need credit cards, where you need mortgage debt, not just for the education, not just for the house, but for simple things like medical surgeries. We live in an age where people who require treatment for cancer are going on, GoFundMe campaigns to raise money from their friends and others to help them pay for their surgeries. Now, are these irresponsible people? Are these, the stereotype is that, people on welfare are fat, they drink too much, they're not responsible, blah, 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 blah. But, those kinds of arguments might work in times of prosperity to refer to poor people with some modicum of success. But post 2008, it just wasn't true, because these were ordinary Americans. These were the middle class. Also kind of falling into these dire straits. And so, again, as I was sort of arguing, 2008 exposed the lie that we do have to kind of rent our existence through debt. Everything now is debt. And it's because, in a sense, we've shifted to an economy based on financialization as opposed to an economy based on the production of things, which, if capitalism ever worked, it worked best when there were actually factories and people had real jobs. So what does any of this have to do with anarchism? Anarchism is a complex phenomena. You can think about it in terms of the lack of government articulated by people like Thomas Hobbes, the lack of sovereignty. Remember, I said to you once upon a time that the most famous quote by any native English speaker in political science was probably Hobbes's. Hobbes's famous argument that in the state of nature, life is nasty, brutish, solitary, and short. That is the kind of definition of anarchism, or anarchy rather, that animates and inspires the realists, the liberals, and the constructivists. But if you're an anarchist, you have a very different definition of anarchism or anarchy in mind. So let's recap. International politics say the anarchy theorists is composed of sovereign nation states who want to survive. And in order to survive, they engage in self-help, right? You remember the 3 S's. We talked about it a long time ago now. It feels like ages ago, but it was the start of our semester together 15 weeks ago. These assumptions, the 3 S's, are seen to be the timeless wisdom drawn from the ancient theorists, Thucydides, Machiavelli, and of course Hobbes. But clearly the framing of anarchy from those perspectives is that anarchy is a problem. Anarchy is something to overcome. And anarchists themselves flip this, and here in the screen right now is a guy called David Graeber, a very well-known anarchist and one of the leading theorists and advocates of the Occupy Wall Street movement. He and other anarchists would reject entirely Hobbes's premise about anarchy and say that anarchy is not a Hobbesian state of nature. Instead, they say it is something much more potent, something much more vital. And we have some quotes here on the screen to help us think through what anarchism means from the perspective of an actual anarchist. On the one hand here, we see that anarchism is the commitment to the idea that it would be possible to have a society based on principles of self-organization, voluntary association, and importantly, mutual aid. Now, this sort of idea, this promise of an idea of a voluntary society, a society without sovereignty, is not hard to imagine, say the anarchists, because we already, in a sort of everyday, quotidian sense, have such a society. Ordinary human beings relate to each other this way all the time. If you see two children fighting over a toy, your immediate instinct is to tell them that they have to share, right? Take turns. And what is that? What is that? Only a recognition of the sort of what an anarchist would call primitive communism, of the basic nature of human society. If your neighbor comes over and asks you for some sugar or a pint of milk and you have some and they don't, and you want to spare them the trouble of going to the shop, you give it to them and you trust that they'll give it back the next day. You show kindness to those in your life, oftentimes without really any kind of contract, without any real sort of sense that they will necessarily pay it back. It could be 6 months later and they might do you an act of kindness, but you didn't expect it, right? You just did it because it was the right thing to do. And I'd really love it if you guys could think about that for a second, because it's central to the kind of optimistic potential of human beings that anarchists are inspired to see in us. And it's on that basis that they can make claims like anarchism is possible, direct democracy without the government is possible. And then they also say, and this is the final kind of quote here, anarchism is much more than simply grassroots democracy. It ultimately aims to eliminate all social relations from wage labor to patriarchy that can only be maintained by the systematic threat of force. So, it's this idea that, there are numerous social relations, gender relations, racial relations that are kind of ultimately maintained. The status quo is maintained by force. And you can see this clearly. I just would use the example of race relations in the United States, what's really been exposed. And I hope this won't be seen as a partisan remark, but what's really been exposed, I think, in the last 8 years or so, as well as everything else, is that, it wasn't enough just simply to have a black president for racism to be seen as not a problem in America anymore, because the advent of the cell phone showed us in no uncertain terms, everyone has a camera now and everyone can, film if they come across an incident of a police officer dealing with a person of color. And we see that our officers are often brutally dismissive of the rights of black people, people of color in the United States. It's very sad to see, but the evidence would seem to be overwhelming that is the case. And if we have compassion, if we have a sensitivity to the need for equality, and this is, of course, what anarchists are advocating, then we must recognize that as an injustice. So anarchism isn't just about the overthrow of capitalism. It's about the overthrow of any societal relationship that seems to be maintained in place by force, and arguably the obedience and social kind of complicity of African Americans in this country, for example, has been maintained in no small sense by the threat of violence and by the fear of the police, who deal with black people in a very different way than they deal with white people, I think, to be sure. There's plenty of evidence to back that up.